Holographic exhibitions. I'm local, I live in Beacon, just where I live. And I've been involved with trying to get a non-for-profit at the Centre for Fourth Dimensional Arts happening. It's a struggle these days. But I'm also just beginning to teach a course, an online course in digital holography, which I'm now, because of the computer networking possibilities, I'm able to have students from all over the world. So that's actually beginning next Saturday. And I'm going to be offering other courses at various different levels through that. And you can read about holography on my blog at artinthefifthdimension.com.
Hi, I'm Eric Johnson. I'm currently doing tintypes, and I guess the main thing I was going to talk about is it seems weirdly not relevant to a lot of people to do tintype, so I kept asking myself, why am I going through mixing the chemistry? I could explain a little bit about the process for people who don't know. You're taking a substrate like we're using aluminum today, but they would have used iron or glass. And you're using something that was called gun cotton at the time, which is a cotton dissolved in acid as a substrate to hold on the silver, sensitizing it. So all these things are steps in a process, maybe too lengthy to get into, so I guess the big question was, why do you go through all that? And part of it for me is it's a historical thing that sort of needs, in a way, needs to be continued. And it's a way of seeing something with a wavelength of light that you wouldn't normally see, UV mostly. So I think that's the real fascinating part about it. In a modern way, and I realize that from a modern perspective, you can't really shoot the same way or perspective that people did in those days. People are fascinated with the imperfections, especially the majority of people don't want it to look perfect. They want a little bit of the chemistry to be irregular in some way or other, or it to have more texture. And one reason to shoot it also is the heightened level of texture that it puts out. Daguerreotypes probably were like the finest photographic process. And we've been on a downhill slide, ever since, except for the Kodak when it put out the disc camera. That was the low point of photography. It doesn't get any worse than that. A little disc with a piece of film so small you can barely see it. So people, historically they realized that they created something that was utterly amazing in daguerreotype. Polished plate of copper with silver on it. The resolution on it is like, you just kind of marvel at it. Then you start to make compromises. The calotype was next, probably, and a cyanotype, and those were paper substrates. So if you're using paper, you're getting all that texture. And their manufactured paper at that time probably wasn't maybe as good as what we can do now. So then suddenly you're taking a paper negative, and then you're laying it on top and shining light through it, making contact. But the exciting part was you could make multiples. Daguerreotype, you got one. And copying is really kind of more of a challenge, especially in those days. So the exciting part is suddenly Frederick Archer in 1851 comes up with this process. He's a mediocre sculptor in England. He'd gone through the trades of silversmithing as a kid, as a teenager. And so he's made a few busts, and he wants to get his work out there. So it's all about promotion for him. He's made these two busts of a few lords in England, and he decides that he's going to, he needs these copies of stuff. He needs to sell the copies. And because obviously the sculpture goes to the guy, and he's kind of done, So he became utterly fascinated with it, and nothing really worked at the time. And he had a friend who was in the medical profession. His name was Hugh, I think his last name. I'll think of it later. But two of them kind of worked on this, and the idea, Fox Talbot really had the idea of licensing photography, the way Microsoft would license your software. And so there was a bunch of lawsuits, and they were fighting it out. I believe 350 pounds was one of the lawsuits, one of the photographers. So what finally happened is the lawsuits really didn't go anywhere, and after a few years, then you have this process that anybody could do. You didn't have to license it. You could can buy the chemicals, you can learn it, and suddenly there's an explosion. So tintype and wet collodion process, which is what we're talking about, it just suddenly exploded, and people were doing it constantly. It even got down to like the camera that Frederick Archer, the key thing that he did was he also developed other parts of the process. It wasn't just the process, he had a camera with the darkroom in it. And when you're shooting a wet plate, it has to get processed in about 15 to 20 minutes. And depending, if you're in the desert, let's say, it could evaporate much more quickly. So you got a short time span there. So that was one of the drawbacks to it. But he developed the other accoutrements that went along with it to make the process a useful thing, rather than it being like, here's some technology and go do what you want with it. So he really worked out. He died penniless. He had 3 kids. One of them lived to adulthood. His wife died shortly after him. So he did all that, and I think he's much more recognized for it at the time. Obviously, he was a bump in the road to a bunch of people who just wanted to sue him for coming up with this process. Anyway, I decided to do this. I didn't know any of this stuff. I had the school I went to, we didn't have a good background on the history of photography, and so a lot of this stuff is very exciting and new to me. Some of the historical parts of it. But what it really comes down to for any photographer is the look. You see this thing and you just say, wow, I'm entranced with it. Every time I see it, it's a surprise. And that little bit of surprise is very exciting. Whether you're photographing people or objects, and, the warm colors don't really register. Like a red shirt like that might go relatively dark. But something blue would tend to be more, more like a bounce back on that. So that's what I have to say, pretty much. I could go on.
Another interesting phenomenon about holography is that there is almost equal representation of women. For a very technological medium, that's a really interesting thing. And but during the late 60s into the early 70s, we just saw the emergence of this. Salvador Dali started working with it in the early 70s with a group in San Francisco. We saw an early show in New York in the early 70s, but then the first major one was 1975 at the International Center of Photography. And we had, that was a totally breakthrough show. It was my first exposure to holography. And also for Rudy Burkow, whose work is here, you can see at the front of the gallery next door. And that's actually through that show is how I met Rudy. We literally both made our first hologram together in the first classes we both took, because by then, independently, we were both completely obsessed by it. And he became a very dear friend of mine. And he became part of a group of holographers in New York City that were doing some really groundbreaking work. And shortly after that was the opening of the New York Museum of Holography down on Mercer Street. Some of you have had contact with holography, may have been there. And that was open until the early 90s. And in the 80s, I was curator there for a period of time, and Susan was director of education there. And that was an enormously important place. Many really pivotal shows happened there, and a lot was going on there during the 80s. And a lot was going on in holography in the 80s, all over the world. Big shows. And it was being developed both commercially and artistically. And different types of holograms were emerging with different techniques, different lasers, different chemistry, different optics. And you'll see some examples of that here. Rudy's work next door, some of that is rainbow holography, and when we walk around I'll talk a little bit more about rainbow holograms, and he has some diffraction gratings there, which are another aspect. Mary Harmon is working with reflection holograms here, which she collages with other images. Susan works with reflection here, but uses a different technique to control color. And Rudy, the reflection pieces you see at the front, is some of his later work, that was done with a very unique system in his facility in his house upstate New York. And he was really striving to achieve a technique where he was essentially painting with light. And that piece you have here is one of 3 of the last pieces that he did, which I think is some of the best work in his whole career. Although he has good work in various different stages. I'll talk a bit more about that later. But what you're seeing represented here is, these are all examples of what is coming to be known as analog holography, which means that in these cases the artists are largely working on their own systems, using optics and lasers and very special vibration isolation tables. And these are a photographic process that has evolved on. I mean, although it's using lasers, it still uses a lot of the same types of techniques, because we shoot onto a silver halide emulsion that's coated onto a piece of glass or a piece of film. And it's processed with similar types of chemistry. In fact, some of that chemistry that was tuned for holography came out of much earlier work too. So it follows through the same processes. Digital holography, which is what a lot of it is moving into now too, is you can create images in a 3D model program and create many different views, which then can be output to essentially a digital printer, which will print essentially a holographic pixel at a time and build a bigger image. And it's still a holographic process. It still has to be shot on a table with a laser and into a photosensitive medium, but it's able to translate digital data into that, so you can make images of anything, as opposed to this type of holography is largely requires a physical object of some kind that light reflects off of to make that image. So we have an evolution of the technology. I think, still analog holography has very unique magic to it that can only be accomplished with analog holography. And but one of the things we struggle with there is getting the right material to record it onto, and that's been an ongoing struggle. But people are still doing it, and there is amazing work out there, and I hope you will continue to look for more examples for hologram and go to see shows.
Okay, well, my name is Sue Carroll, Richard, and I have 4 pieces in the show, and I'll be happy to talk about that when we walk around the gallery. I was trained in holography at the Royal College of Art in London. I was one of the first people to go through that school and graduated with a degree in holography, which was very new in the 80s. Actually, this is my 30th year working in holography. And I was very interested in my work in pioneering the integration of more traditional art media in with the new technology. In fact, in the 80s, it was before, computers were certainly around, but they weren't in the place where they are now. So I had a kind of vision of holography which didn't quite grow into the vision that it appeared to be. But I still have that vision, and I think one day we will be able to generate 3-dimensional light images with computers directly, as opposed to going through like the process that Lou was talking about. But when I was very young, in my 20s, that was my vision. So when I applied to Royal College, I was very naive, and I thought, well, I'll be doing that in a couple of years. But of course, I wasn't, because as Linda describes, it's very actually it's quite a cumbersome process. And I had initially disappointed my teachers because they all thought I was going to be a scientist, and then I went to art school, and they were all horrified. But actually, then they sort of got a little happier when I told them I was working with scientists and I was doing these very scientific, artistic things. So I did actually work with some amazing scientists at the Royal College, because there weren't any artists who knew how to do this. So they were panicking because they had these students and all this equipment and nobody knew how to use it. So they brought these scientists in, and I was able to get some wonderful mentorship under people like Nick Phillips, who was an amazing teacher, and then there was all kinds of people that came from that facility. But anyway, my concern always was to try to bring in, the aesthetics of fine art and integrate them into this new light medium. And it wasn't easy to do, and I can't say that I ever achieved it, but I tried. And integrating drawing into holography was really my main focus, and still is, trying to make three-dimensional drawings. So, like if anyone's ever seen that famous picture of Picasso when he's drawing the world in space with light, I was trying to generate drawings like that in a holographic space. And my interest in that really dates back from my childhood, because I was always a kid staring at the puddles with like the weird patterns in them, and staring at the light when you're on a train and all the reflections you get. And my parents had like a glass kitchen door, and I used to play with my toys because it used to reflect like those 50s rhino patterns, and you'd get like the Pepper's Ghost effects. And I used to play with the light. And so my influences, my ideas about creating three-dimensional light forms really stems from those childhood experiences and the kinds of exposures I had. And my dad had a workshop in our house. He was a craftsman, and he used to dabble with all sorts of things. So we played with bits of perspex and project light through it and do all sorts of things. So when I look back now, that's really where my interest in using holography as a medium. And then it was also, I was very interested in it conceptually, what Linda mentioned about it being the whole image. Like if you cut a hologram up, it's the whole image in every part. So I had been reading a writer, about the Renaissance. Her name was Frances Yates. Some of you might be familiar with her. And she wrote this great book called The Art of Memory. And mnemonics is something that we sort of forgotten. We all know when we don't have our memory, like when we get past 50, we can't remember anymore. But it used to be an art where you would study all of the classics and all of the objects, and there were people who were the mnemonics, and they had to remember all these things. So she wrote this great book called The Art of Memory, and so I was very influenced by that because it sort of connected to my ideas about holography. So a lot of my early work, that I'll show you, was inspired by that. And many other sort of literature and poetry has very influenced my work. And also the fact that a hologram to me represents, it's a little bit like a talisman. So it becomes like an image of light that kind of ignites something inside me, like a sort of like a psychic trigger or whatever. And that's very personal. Some people think that doesn't exist, but for me, that was what attracted me to holography. That it became this talismanic image, and I think all art can be like that. All great art is like that. But for me, holography somehow had a connectedness to the reality of consciousness, if you will. So it's kind of trying to get close to what consciousness is. Like when we die, our bodies die. Does our consciousness die? Nobody knows. So it's a little bit like, those philosophical questions about life. So it's a little bit about
The two pieces that are in here are, just refresh myself here. This is one of his earlier pieces, and these are rainbow holograms. And it's a multiple step process to create them. Now, if you make a laser transmission hologram, it requires a laser to make the hologram, and it requires a laser to view it. If you take a hologram that's been made with a laser in that way, transmission means that it's being lit from behind. As this is a white light transmission hologram, so it's being lit from behind. And you'll notice the holograms in the other room are being lit from in front, so we call those reflection holograms. So that's the first distinction here. But had this been a laser transmission hologram, we would have had to have a laser up there, and if I put a white light on it, you wouldn't see the image. It would be each wavelength. Well, white light is made up of many different wavelengths. Laser light is one or a very narrow band of wavelengths. So when that light from the laser would hit the hologram bends it into a pattern that comes to your eyes. Now, if you take a white light and illuminate a laser transmission hologram, each different wavelength gets bent to a different degree according to that wavelength, and then they all overlap each other, and that laser transmission hologram with a white light would look very blurred. You would not be able to see the image. So in order to be able to view holograms, a laser transmission hologram with white light, a technique was developed by Dr. Stephen Benton in the mid to late 70s that evolved the rainbow hologram. And Steve was at MIT in the spatial imaging lab, and he worked very closely with artists. He always involved artists in the process. He was a brilliant man, and he was a very generous man, and he loved to party as well, and he loved hanging out with holographic artists. He was very much part of that whole scene, was very involved in the Museum of Holography. And he taught a workshop in New York through New York's holographic labs in I think it was somewhere around 1977, just as the museum was going, where he taught the mathematics and the technique for making multicolor transmission holograms, white light transmission holograms. So if this had been a very straightforward white light transmission or rainbow hologram, you would see this image, just the whole image would, and as you move up and down in front of it, it would shift in turn through each of the colors. Because what he did is he'd make a laser transmission hologram, and then he'd make a copy of it into another hologram. But in between the two, he would put a slit. And that slit is actually optically imaged in here. So when the light from the white light source up there hits this, it's out there in space, you can't see it, a virtual slit. The slit bends the light, each wavelength to a different amount, and spreads it. So you get a rainbow, and then you see the whole image in each of the colors in turn. But he then took it a step further, and by making multiple masters, so as Rudy did here, there's probably at least 3 masters.
Three masters.
And he then, by the exact placement, he learned to do the math from Steve Benton. You can make it so that you can place color in different parts of the image. So when you move up and down in front of this image and look at it, you'll see that each part is discretely colored, but it's a different color range from the others. So he's located color in space. But he's doing other things too. He developed his own unique techniques to produce these animated effects. A lot of that was kept secret for a long time. He had a very proprietary process that he kept to himself. In the 90s, he published a paper in the SPID magazine or journal where he talked about how to do this, and he presented a paper, and he generously gave that information out at that time. It's pretty sophisticated how he achieved that, so I'm not really going to go into all of that. But when you look at these images, I want you to really look at all the different parts that are going on in here, and to also think in terms of something that he always talked about, was that you, the viewer, are like the needle on the record of a record player, and the hologram is the record that you're playing. So and there's a kind of a holographic dance that you do, particularly in front of his, because there's so much going on in them. Because you've got a whole volume in space to explore, so that you don't look at holograms by just standing in front of them like you do the photograph. You have to interact with them, and it's holographic dance.
This is a very early hologram. This is 1979.
So we're out to
It's pretty, and it's I don't know if anyone has heard of the B-52s, but he named it Planet Claire because he's a very good friend of the lead singer of the B-52s. In 1979, hardly anyone knew who they were, but he was a good friend of his, and that's one of the things that came out of that. Also, something about this is that the image size is 8 by 10. At the time, pretty much it was very difficult to get glass plates that were made more bigger than 8 by 10 unless you were really connected. So Rudy did a lot of his holograms on 8x10, but then he came out, he started wearing 12x16 plates, which Kodak made, by the way. He started transferring all his 8x10 images onto 12x16, so you get more space around them. They feel more free floating. But I think the real, and one of the other things that Rudy did was he was not a trained scientist. He was basically an artist that was fascinated by light. He started in the 1960s. He did stage lighting for a disco, actually, something called the Milky Way in Holland. And out of that, he became very interested in light. And then in 1975, he saw that very interesting Hollywood show at the International Center of Photography, which at the time was on 91st Street, I believe.
Yes.
And he became fascinated with it, and he just started exploring. So, one of the things that is interesting about Rudy is that he was not a scientist, but he actually sort of was able to translate what science was doing into something artistic, something that was actually very complex scientifically, and translate into something that that someone could actually see and enjoy, an image. And I think that's a very important aspect of Rudy's sort of legacy in the holography world, is that he brought something that was unique, and he went further than just trying to work with dimensions. He was working with light, he was working with science, and he put it all together.
Yeah, I mean, other than your image on your credit card and your license, are there commercial applications for this?
A lot. Every time you go through a supermarket scanner, there's a diffraction grating in there that is scanning over your purchases, the barcode. That's a holographic technology. It is being used for storing data, very high density data. The blue lasers that came out with the vehicle for that to happen. It's basically
Fiber optics.
Yeah.
They actually use fiber optics to. It's sort of holographic science that transmits data through fiber optics. It's light, and so it's the holographic technique that actually somehow transmits light through those. Because I remember there was a lot of those scientific things coming out in the 80s, and I was always reading about them. The fiber optics were a big connection to a lot of
It's being used for medical imaging. It has been largely the biggest part, the most successful in terms of monetary return from it, has been as a security device, which obviously the MasterCard is an example, but it's been used for authentication on anything from an Intel chip to whatever. So that's where the money has been made on it. And in some ways that kind of limited the art because they kept certain techniques inaccessible. They were proprietary for that technique. And never really included artists in the process. They trained technicians to do this because it was all kept very secure. But some of those patents are running out now. Things are changing right now. We've gone through another technological leap in that lasers have shrunk. The lasers that almost all of us worked with early on were largely air-cooled gas lasers that were very, very large and cost maybe 50 grand. Whereas now you can get a small diode laser that has to be, these kind, but generally they're a bit more involved because they have to be more stable. So they're not quite as cheap as these, but they have special stabilization in them. But we've jumped from maybe 50,000 down to 10,000. And where we had, this was all single wavelength recording or narrow band. So these were all red, for example, working with red lasers. Now we can get panchromatic emulsions, but it's hard to get a good supply of them. Kodak dropped out. Kodak, Ilford, Agfa, Polaroid, Fuji, all have made holographic material at one time or another, and none of them make it any longer because they never developed a big enough market for it. The biggest hope right now is a photopolymer material that's being developed by Bayer in Germany, which has been, I think, is pretty much there now for a full color panchromatic emulsion, which does not require any processing. You just flash it with UV light at the end of your exposure to cure it, and then that's it, no chemicals. But it is not that sensitive, so it requires still pretty powerful lasers to record it, but it's kind of a big hope for holography, I think.